Hello and welcome to the Bible and Beyond podcast from early Christian texts. We explore historical and spiritual questions about Jesus, gender, women, salvation, healing, and the meaning of life. Shirley Paulson is hosting a series of conversations with scholars who are able to unlock mysteries from extra-canonical books, forgotten scriptures, so-called Gnostic Gospels, and the Bible. Thanks to a generous AAR, Loose Advancing Public Scholarship grant, we are now offering a completely free online course titled Introducing Nag Hammadi and Related Texts. In 24 video lectures, you'll gain a fundamental understanding of recently discovered texts written by early Jesus followers. Just visit bibleandbeyond.courses to enroll. And now, here's Shirley Paulson.
We've been thinking about the Nag Hammadi Library lately, what it is, what it means. So I'm grateful that our conversation today will give us a chance to get up close and look more carefully at one specific text from the Nag Hammadi Library that, frankly, most of us don't know very well. This is the Gospel of Philip. And our guest scholar today, who's going to help us make sense of this, is Dr. Kimberley Fowler. Kim is assistant professor of New Testament at the University of Groningen. Is that how you say it? In the Netherlands? Okay. Her research focuses especially on the Coptic text of the Nag Hammadi Codices. Kimberley is currently writing a monograph on the Gospel of Philip for Cambridge University Press, as well as a short volume on the Nag Hammadi Codices for Cambridge's Elements in Early Christianity Studies. What a treat to have you with us today, Kimberley. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here for a chat.
All right, so getting to know Jesus outside the canonical writings feels both daunting and shady, since it wasn't authorized by the church authorities in antiquity. But I have to say, people do get curious when they hear that there was an ancient text that tells us that Jesus kissed Mary Magdalene. So really, is that true? Is that modern fiction, or is that a genuine ancient text?
Well, yeah, this is true. We do have an ancient text that describes Jesus kissing Mary Magdalene, and this is, in fact, the Gospel of Philip, which, as you've already mentioned, is one of the more sort of confusing and yet, I think, very fascinating texts that was found amongst the Nag Hammadi Codices in the Egyptian desert in 1945. And while most people tend to consider these as stemming from some sort of Gnostic Christian thought, while that may or may not be true, and there are big debates around that, I personally think that what is perhaps more interesting about them is the fact that they were clearly copied out, produced, and used by Christian monks in the area. So this is how I tend to try and approach them, and this informs a lot of what I think about the Gospel of Philip itself. So the Gospel of Philip it's sort of funny in terms of its format. It's essentially a set of theological teachings, theological reflections, mostly on the Christian sacraments, and on how Christian initiates can work their way up to becoming more Christ-like themselves. So it takes in a lot of different themes as it goes. Some things are mentioned only in passing. Some things get a lot more elaboration. And one of the things that it talks about is this supposed kiss. But this has been interpreted in a lot of different ways. I have my own views on it, which are probably much less exciting than some people would like them to be.
Well, then, so this is interesting that you're talking about these sort of doctrines, and all of a sudden we have this kiss in the middle of things. So is this like proof that Jesus had a romantic relationship with Mary, or even that they might have been married? I mean, what can we tell about the relationship in this?
Yeah, I'm sorry to kind of kill the buzz. I think, unfortunately, no.
Okay.
This does not tell us that they had a romantic relationship. It certainly doesn't tell us that they were married. What we can tell from the Gospel of Philip is that Jesus and Mary Magdalene are portrayed as being very close. So the author of this text portrays them as having a very special relationship, but I think this is purely in spiritual terms. So when the other disciples, for example, ask Jesus, why do you love Mary more than you love us? He doesn't say, oh, well, this is because she's my wife, or anything quite as juicy as that. What he does do is sort of respond with a bit of wisdom about, knowledge and that sort of thing. So it's not quite as juicy as we want it to be. And the bit of the text where it's mentioned that he used to kiss her has a few gaps in it, which of course has led to a lot of speculation, because people are like, oh, where did he kiss her? Like, why did he kiss her? And this sort of thing. I suspect that this is much more likely to be some sort of ritual kiss or kiss of peace that we do have a lot of evidence for between Christians in the patristic writings, even in the New Testament, for example. And within the Gospel of Philip itself, we have other mentions of Christians kissing each other, potentially as part of a sort of ritual context or an initiatory context or something like that. So I think this is the sort of thing that we need to imagine when we're talking about Mary. It's not a romantic thing. And even if the Gospel of Philip did explicitly say that they were married or that they were kissing in a romantic way, that wouldn't necessarily mean there was a historical basis for that fact. I think that's really important to remember.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, that's helpful. Actually, it's okay if we want to think about the fact that he had an intimate relationship with her, or even a special relationship with her. But then that raises another question, because the title of this book is the Gospel of Philip. Is she more important, or is he more important? Is this like the disciple of Jesus who wrote this, or how does Philip get into this?
Yeah, this is the $1 million question,
Okay.
which again, no one has a firm answer to.
Okay.
So what makes the Gospel of Philip a little bit different from a text like the Gospel of Mary, for example, where Mary is very much a key character in the text, is that Philip, whoever Philip is, whether he's, Jesus's disciple or some other Philip, does not play any central role in the text at all. We don't have a developed narrative around any figure called Philip. We have one throwaway mention to the Apostle Philip to introduce something else that the text is talking about. Okay, so to introduce one of the themes, the Apostle of Philip said this, but it's not enough, I don't think, to construct any kind of major theory about the importance of this figure for the meaning of the text. So there are several ways that you can sort of interpret this. One of the issues that we have is that we only have one copy of this text. So it's not like for, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the letters of Paul, where we have lots of different manuscripts. We only have the one copy from Nag Hammadi of this text. So we don't actually know whether this text that we now know as the Gospel of Philip has always been called the Gospel of Philip, or whether the people that copied out the only version that we have added that in themselves, or whether somebody before them added it in at a later date. We just have absolutely no way to know how long this title has been connected with the text that it's attached to. And so a lot of scholars have sort of hypothesized, well, we know that in early Christianity, apostolic names carried a lot of weight. They were sort of very useful to have attached to texts because they give it some sort of authority, some credentials. So it could be that somebody wanted to lend some authority to the teachings that are presented in this text and thought, oh, well, who shall I use? Oh, it mentions Philip at one point, so I guess now this is the Gospel of Philip. But certainly this is not the work of one of Jesus's disciples. This is a text that is written much, much later, probably in around the 3rd century, or maybe even a little bit later than that. It's a bit hard to say. But yeah, Philip, I think, is only very sort of tangentially connected to the actual content.
Oh, that's interesting. So since Mary's in there, could be the second gospel of Mary then too, but oh well, okay.
I mean, she's got more of a role than Philip does, to be honest. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, okay, so this is such an interesting book. Would you say that you like it, or are you just studying it as a study guide or something? What's your feeling about this book?
Oh, I love this book. I think it's one of the best things at Nag Hammadi. Lots of people would disagree with me.
Okay.
I have been very much a fan of this text for, I would say, about 15 years now, which is when I first encountered it as a student. And it struck me for being sort of charmingly and remarkably weird, yet at the same time, I think not so different from a lot of what we would find in certain parts of Paul, for example, or, quite orthodox theology in many ways. It's always seemed to me like it's trying to sound sort of high and mighty, very intelligent. This is an author that clearly has a very, very particular view of Christology, of theology, of the sacraments, and is explaining them in often very convoluted ways. So it's a bit of a puzzle to try and figure out what this text is trying to do, and even what it is. Like, how does it understand itself? What is it trying to be? And for me, that just made it kind of all the more charming. But for a lot of people, that means, throw it in the dustbin, read something else.
Well, then you piqued my curiosity anyway, because I think all these texts in Nag Hammadi are so different from each other. And so this sounds like it's a very, very different one, and yet something interesting there. I like the way you say it's charming.
Yeah, I find it quite charming. And I mean, it has sort of thematic connections to other texts at Nag Hammadi, but it's a very confounding text. And I think a lot of people just don't quite know what to do with it, because, it's not a gospel in the way that we understand gospels usually. So what does that really mean? It kind of seems to just be like a collection of someone's theological notes, or their sort of extended musings on the sacraments, and every part of it makes sense in relation to every other part of it. I truly believe that that's the case, but it's not a very user-friendly text. I think that's probably the best way to put it.
Right. Okay. Well, then let's get into some of the specific things that it gets at. We may as well go back to Jesus and Mary again.
Yeah.
Since you've established that they weren't married, does the text say anything about marriage in general as one of these topics?
Yeah. So marriage is something that actually holds quite a central role in the text.
Okay.
As with many things in Philip, precisely what it thinks, what the author thinks, can be a little bit unclear at times. But I think the sort of basic position is that marriage, in an earthly sense, as we know it, between man and woman, particularly sex and reproduction, is defiled. This is not good at all. It is a very kind of fleshly and imperfect reflection of the much better situation, which is spiritual union. And here we get a very, very important term that the text likes to use, called the bridal chamber. And we read about the bridal chamber in other so-called Gnostic texts as well. And it can mean sort of different things in different places. And it's hard to give a very, very quick definition, but I will try for the sake of your listeners.
Yeah.
And I think really what it means in Philip is a kind of mysterious metaphor for the unity of Christian believers with the Savior and with Christ. So earthly marriage is something that the text recognizes as happening. It understands that it is a part of life, but it is essentially a kind of imperfect reflection of something much greater. And because sex and reproduction and all these things that are associated with marriage are very much based in the flesh, and the author doesn't really like the flesh very much for the most part, he, she, they, whoever has written this text doesn't want to promote it in that sense. I think they kind of accept it as, you know, something that happens, something that, you know, be married if you must. A little bit like Paul is perhaps saying, you know, in his correspondence with the Corinthians, you know, you must be married, fine, whatever, but there's actually a much better union that you should be seeking after.
Well, is this bridal chamber, would you say it's kind of like the one that we're more familiar with in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, where there's a bridal chamber there? Is that a similar kind of bridal chamber, or are they kind of different here?
I mean, there's certainly a lot of the Matthean material that I think is informing some of the language that we're seeing in the Gospel of Philip. And actually, I mean, more broadly speaking, the sort of marital and bridal language that we get even from the Hebrew Bible, you know, with sort of God and Israel, that then comes into the way that Christ and his church are described in early Christianity. I think this is all sort of fueling understandings of what the bridal chamber means in Gnostic texts like Philip. And for some of these texts, it's really thinking about what is often called the pleroma, or the fullness, this sort of higher realm where you have these beings, these sort of beings that have their counterparts, and they kind of join together. And the idea is that, you know, human beings are supposed to try and sort of emulate this and partake in this. And in the Gospel of Philip, it's very much a case of trying to sort of overcome everything in the fleshly realm, to be at one with the Savior in the bridal chamber. And that's the sort of ultimate aim, really, of all the sacraments and the Christian's sacramental journey.
Wow, that's very helpful, Kim. I feel like you're telling us that this is setting up kind of a model for us to be thinking about how we live our lives that are imperfect now, but we have this kind of maybe spiritual model that we're trying to follow.
Yeah, I think that would be a fair way to read it. Like, at times the text can be very, very polemical about the earth, the material world, and everything in it. It's certainly not a fan of much of that, but I think is really focused on, well, how do we then overcome that? Like, how do we sort of navigate this to get to something greater? And this is where Jesus comes in.
Okay, so then as far as Jesus is concerned, from what you've said so far, it sounds like this gospel is more about Jesus' teachings than it's like, what do we think of a gospel story like in Jesus' life, as you mentioned before? So is that true? Would you call it a gospel then that way?
Yeah. Again, a very reasonable and you know, perfectly good question. It's not a gospel in the sense that I think most people would understand it. So I think the majority of our kind of understanding, when you say, you know, what is a gospel text, comes from what we know from the New Testament. So the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are essentially kind of narrative biographies or something like that of Jesus' life. They tell us about his life, his works, his death, his resurrection, amongst other things that they do, of course. But what we get in the Gospel of Philip is not this at all. We get little snippets of information about, you know, Jesus's life, death, but they're really only in relation to what the text is wanting to tell us about how that affects us now and what we're supposed to do. So what are we supposed to do in response to those things? This is what the Gospel of Philip is interested in. So calling it a gospel really comes back to what I was saying earlier about the title of the text, and the fact that it has the gospel according to Philip written underneath it, right? This is how someone at some point in time decided to characterize the text. So the version that we have is being presented to us as a gospel. And so for me, that's kind of enough. If it's identifying this way, if someone is identifying it this way, I think that's completely fine. And I'm happy to accept that. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily helpful to call it anything else. We can understand it as a set of theological teachings. We can understand it as something that is focused mainly on sacramental practice and on how we're supposed to behave as Christians in that regard. But if it's calling itself a gospel, then fine. I'm going to call it that too, All
right, we'll go with that. Maybe in light of what we're calling it and identifying it with, maybe could you talk a little bit about why you would think it would be in the collection with Nag Hammadi things if it's different from all the rest? Like, how does it connect with Nag Hammadi?
Yeah. So, I mean, the Nag Hammadi Codices more broadly contain all sorts of very, very varied texts, as you'll very well know. And so one of the things that scholars, including myself, have tried to do to make sense of this collection in some way is to try and break it down into smaller units. So we have the codices as these individual books. And presumably, somebody decided that certain texts were to be put together for certain reasons, okay? And in some codices, the connections are stronger than each other, or stronger than in others, should I say.
And let me stop you for a second. Can you talk about what a codice is?
So a book, just a book, basically. So the Nag Hammadi Codices are just a series of books, all of which contain a number of these quote unquote Gnostic texts, but really just Christian texts. This is how I tend to refer to them. They're just Christian texts. And so I think in the Gospel of Philip's case, it sits beside the Gospel of Thomas, one of the other very, very famous texts from this collection, which has lots of different sayings of Jesus and very strong connections to the canonical Gospels. Also the Apocryphon of John, this wonderful kind of revelation of Jesus to John, and this kind of wonderful sort of creation myth that we find there. And there are also a couple of texts in this book, this codex, that really focus on eschatology, on the end times, and on, what you need to do to get your soul to the right condition for this. So the Gospel of Philip is sitting beside this wonderful selection of texts that are all dealing with these very interesting things. And I think for me, what it is doing there is it is offering some further musings on, how we might understand the sacraments from the New Testament, how we might respond to them in daily life. And for me, imagining this, I'm making a thumbs up, apparently. I don't know how I did that. But for me, who very much imagines the Nag Hammadi Codices to have been produced by Egyptian monks in Egypt nearby, for me, a text like the Gospel of Philip would resonate really well with them because, it doesn't like the material world very much. It wants to focus on higher spiritual truths. It's, perhaps not the biggest fan of marriage and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
All of which I think would make a lot of sense to that type of audience. So
that's interesting.
Yeah. So it has things in common with other Nag Hammadi texts, I think, but it's also difficult to say that these codices are a very neat collection. We really don't know precisely what it was that tied them together. All we can say is that at some point, people decided that they needed to probably bury these or get rid of them, or at least, that's probably one of the strongest theories, and that someone thought they were worth reading in, together, that somebody thought they were worth reading in connection with each other. But, people rarely start at the beginning of a book and read it in one go anyway. So, they all probably had their own discrete functions, and the Gospel of Philip I think, you can pick up and read on its own and take all sorts of interesting things from it without having read anything else from Nag Hammadi.
Yeah. So then let's get back into the content of it again. Um, you talked about the sacraments and so forth. What about the Eucharist, which is one of the major Christian sacraments? Do you think that this Philip's discussion about this adds to our understanding of Christian remembering Jesus' teaching on the Eucharist, or is it so different we can't connect it? How do you think about that?
Yeah. No, I think it actually really reinforces some of the things that we know early Christians were thinking about the Eucharist. So one of the kind of interesting passages in the Gospel of Philip talks about, it's actually trying to make a sort of weird connection with the Syriac language, which is a little bit obscure, and we don't need to get into that. But what it ends up doing is making a connection between Jesus's body being kind of like spread out on the cross at his execution and the Eucharistic bread being spread out on the table. And so it does this sort of weird wordplay thing. And essentially, I think what it's trying to do is strengthen the connection between Jesus's physical body that dies on the cross and the bread that is eaten in the Eucharistic sacrament. So what the author of Philip is really wanting to kind of emphasize to us is the incarnation and the real kind of physicality of Jesus's death and the importance of that, and how that connects to the Eucharist. So this is not an unusual or weird position within early Christian thought more broadly. I mean, this is, I think most people who have read the New Testament or other early Christian texts would think, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's really one of the most important things that I think the Gospel of Philip wants to emphasize.
So it's not trying to fight back against the New Testament. It's kind of maybe deepening or strengthening or adding to or something. Maybe you can go there a little bit and talk about how closely related it is to maybe the more familiar books of the New Testament. Could you talk about its relationship to just the whole New Testament in general?
Yeah, of course. One of the things that originally attracted to me to this text was the fact that it is clearly extremely interested in the New Testament. It knows much of the New Testament really well. I mean, aside of the bits of the Gospels for kind of the Jesus story and all of that, this text has really close connections to parts of Paul. Other letters that we find. It knows the New Testament very well. And what you will often find is not so much that the text will say, in the Gospel of Matthew, it says this, or, when Paul is writing to the Romans, he says this. Not so much like that, but allusions to scripture, language that is so obviously drawing on parts of the New Testament, terminology. Sometimes this is kind of lying a bit under the surface, and sometimes it's more obvious. So for me, probably one of the clearest examples of this is when the text is talking about resurrection, and it engages directly, really, with Paul's discussion of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. So the same kind of language of, resurrection in the flesh, also trying to answer these questions of, how are we resurrected? Is it a fleshly thing? Is it in the body? Is it not in the body? And we've got an almost direct quotation, really, of the words of Paul, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And so, this is an author that knows these texts really well. It's not trying to counter them or compete with them. I think that's not really what this text is trying to do. It's working with them. It's a reader of the New Testament, or what would come to be in the New Testament, and it's doing exegesis in much the same way that we might do exegesis, trying to figure out what these texts say and adding its own sort of thoughts and interpretations to that material.
You might just explain what the word exegesis means here, so that I don't know that everybody knows.
Of course. So exegesis just means interpretation. So when you're reading the Bible and you're trying to figure out what it means, that's basically exactly what that means.
Okay, all right. So, there's an interesting little thing in the Gospel of Philip that is kind of surprising, but you're bringing this up, I think, with your use of the New Testament. I'm thinking about that contrast between the glass vessels and the pottery vessels
Oh, yeah.
as one of these object lessons. Maybe you can explain that, and what do you make of it?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. It's kind of a weird little saying that appears kind of almost on its own next to completely random other things. But it basically, the text talks about how pottery and glass are made in a similar way in that fire is involved in both of them,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
But it says that we have a bit of a distinction in that when you're making a glass vessel, you blow it, right?
Yeah.
Like the process of glass blowing. So there's also breath involved.
Okay.
And you're thinking, where is the author going with this?
Yeah.
And so he says that, if you smash these vessels, there is also a difference, because pottery, once it's smashed, is just smashed. That's the end. It's dead. It's done. But if you smash glass, you can kind of heat it up, reblow it, and it can have a new life, a new form again.
Oh gosh.
And so when you think, what on earth is going on here? I think probably the most logical way to interpret it is imagining the pottery and the glass vessels as people, as human bodies. And so when we all die, that's kind of the same for us all, but there is a key difference, the author thinks. And the key difference is that some human beings have the Holy Spirit. The Christians essentially have the breath of life breathed into them with the Holy Spirit, and they can resurrect, they can be renewed. The people that don't are much like the pots, and that's it. They're just smashed, and their bodies will just be dead. So yeah, I think that's probably what is meant by that sort of slightly obscure analogy.
That's a very interesting example for us maybe to kind of conclude with, in the sense that it's helping us to sort of think about what's he getting at, what's the purpose of this text, even though there are all kinds of random things thrown together there, but there's sort of a theme running through here that I'm picking up. Is there any particular kind of takeaway that you would like us to appreciate about the gospel that we might have missed, or that caught your attention in the first place?
Yeah, I think what I always say when people ask me why should I read the Gospel of Philip
Yeah.
is that I say, the more you read it and the more you stick with it, the more it rewards you. It's basically, I think, some very comprehensible and familiar ideas that we see in the New Testament, that we see in other early Christian sources, just disguised in what is often just slightly confusing and complex language. And you might think, well, I could just go off and read the same ideas in less confusing and complex language. And that's very true. And I suppose I can't really argue with that. But I think it just offers us a really fascinating window into the different ways that certain early Christians were trying to process this material that they have from the scriptures, their ideas about Jesus, and how sometimes it doesn't always come out in ways that are as coherent as future audiences might like. But a lot of work has gone into this. A lot of thought has gone into this. And I think, personally, it's very much worth reading and sticking with it a little bit.
I love the way you're helping us to think about why we would want to read something beyond what we know really well, as it sort of sheds more light on the things that we already know.
Yeah.
It's not like it's fighting it. It's just simply saying, add the light, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's right.
Great. Well, I am so grateful for you to talk about this Gospel of Philip that probably most of us don't know very well. And now we've had just a little bit more information about something in the Nag Hammadi literature. So thank you so much for being with us today, Kim. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And I hope everyone now enjoys the Gospel of Philip.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us today. Be sure to check out the details from this episode by accessing the show notes on our website, earlychristiantext.com/podcasts. Or just come browse around the website to find loads of other content, including blog posts, articles, online courses, our monthly discussion series, and more. We hope you'll consider supporting the work of producing online resources related to the incredible records left behind by the earliest followers of Jesus. You can become a supporting member by joining our Patreon community at patreon.com/Bible and Beyond. We love hearing from you on social media. Find us on Facebook, X, and YouTube by searching for Early Christian Texts. We'll catch you on our next episode of the Bible and Beyond podcast.